Ahab did not destroy everything because he wanted another kingdom. He destroyed everything because he couldn't handle one vineyard. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable, because most people expect great downfalls to begin with great ambitions. Massive wars, huge betrayals, grand schemes. Ahab's downfall started with real estate, a surprisingly small piece of real estate. Ahab was the king of Israel, which meant he had already won by almost every measurable standard: power, money, influence, palaces, servants, armies. If success were a game, Ahab had completed most of the levels already, but sitting beside one of his palaces was a vineyard owned by a man named Naboth. And Ahab wanted it, not needed it, wanted it. There is a difference. The vineyard was close to the palace, convenient, useful, a perfect location for a garden, a simple request, a reasonable idea. At least that's how it looked on the surface. So Ahab approached Naboth and made an offer. He would buy the vineyard, or trade it for a better one. No threats, no pressure, no dramatic villain speech, just a king trying to make a deal. And then Naboth said no, politely, respectfully, legally. The land had belonged to his family for generations. It was inheritance, history, responsibility. In Naboth's mind, it was never for sale, which should have ended the conversation. Instead, it revealed the problem, because the vineyard was never the problem. The answer was, Ahab had just encountered something he wasn't used to hearing: a limit, a boundary, a refusal. And some people handle limits better than others. Naboth heard limits and respected them. Ahab heard limits and took them personally. The king had armies, the king had wealth, the king had authority. But suddenly his attention became trapped by one thing he couldn't have. It's amazing how quickly abundance becomes invisible when desire takes over. Ahab possessed almost everything, yet his focus narrowed onto the one thing outside his reach. The ancient world had finally discovered a universal human condition: wanting the unavailable item. The kingdom remained stable. The king did not. Ahab commanded armies, but apparently one vineyard was winning. Palace, functioning. Government, functioning. Military, functioning. Emotional regulation, currently unavailable. And that's what makes this story so fascinating, because a vineyard cannot expose a kingdom, but it can expose a king. What looked like a property dispute was actually a character test, and Ahab was failing it, badly. The issue was never land. The issue was entitlement, the belief that wanting something was reason enough to possess it. And this is where a small desire reveals a massive flaw, because powerful people often assume their greatest danger is an enemy. Ahab's greatest danger was much closer. It was the part of himself that couldn't accept hearing no. At this point, the situation still looked small. One king, one vineyard, one refusal, nothing more. But some disasters begin quietly. Some collapses start with a conversation, and some kingdoms begin falling apart the moment a powerful man decides that a boundary is an insult, because Naboth's no was about to cause more damage than an invading army. And the worst part? The vineyard hadn't even changed hands yet. Most kings worried about invasions. Ahab was currently losing a battle against disappointment. After Naboth refused the offer, the king returned to his palace, and instead of moving on with his life, he did something far more productive. He sulked. The man responsible for governing a nation walked into his house, lay down on his bed, turned his face toward the wall, and refused to eat. Which is not exactly the behavior people imagine when they hear the phrase powerful ruler. The kingdom had problems. The king had feelings. Guess which one was receiving more attention? And this is where the story gets even more uncomfortable. Because Naboth hadn't cheated him, hadn't insulted him, hadn't threatened him, hadn't stolen anything from him. He had simply said no. A completely legitimate no, the kind of answer normal people hear every day. But Ahab wasn't reacting to injustice, he was reacting to limitation. And there is a difference, a huge difference. The king wasn't suffering because something had been taken from him. He was suffering because something had been denied to him. That may sound similar. It isn't. One is loss. The other is entitlement colliding with reality. Ahab wanted the vineyard. Naboth wanted to keep the vineyard. Only one of those positions violated absolutely nobody's rights. Yet somehow Ahab acted like the victim. Funny how quickly desire can rewrite a story, especially inside someone's own head. The vineyard still belonged to Naboth. The laws had been respected. The conversation was over. And somehow the king was lying in bed, as if civilization had collapsed. Request denied. Emotional systems rebooting. The truly remarkable part is that Ahab already knew he couldn't force Naboth to sell. The law protected ancestral inheritance. This wasn't a legal dispute. It wasn't a political crisis. It wasn't even a negotiation anymore. The answer had been given. The matter was settled. Reality had spoken. Ahab simply didn't like what reality had said, and some people can tolerate almost any hardship except hearing the word no. That's when Queen Jezebel entered the scene, which should immediately make experienced Bible readers nervous. She found Ahab lying there miserable. The king looked less like a ruler and more like a customer preparing a negative online review. Naturally, she asked what was wrong. Ahab explained the situation. He offered to buy the vineyard. Naboth refused. End of story. At least that's how it should have sounded. But when disappointment passes through entitlement, it often comes out looking like injustice. Ahab described the refusal as if something terrible had happened to him. Jezebel listened. And unlike Naboth, she had no respect for boundaries. That was the real danger. Because some people encounter limits and learn humility. Others encounter limits and start looking for ways around them. Ahab lacked the maturity to accept the answer. Jezebel lacked the conscience to respect it. Together, that combination was about to become extremely expensive for someone else. And this is where the problem stops being a vineyard. Because some people don't want something because they need it. They want it because they cannot tolerate not having it. The vineyard had become more than land, more than property, more than a garden. It had become a challenge to Ahab's sense of control. And challenges to control have a way of attracting terrible solutions. The king wanted the vineyard. The queen wanted the obstacle removed. One desired, the other acted. And that's usually when stories like this become dangerous. Because while Ahab was busy feeling sorry for himself, Jezebel was already deciding what to do next. And unlike the king, she wasn't interested in taking no for an answer. Ahab wanted a vineyard. Jezebel delivered a crime. And that is where this story stops being uncomfortable and starts becoming dangerous. Up to this point, the damage had been mostly emotional. Ahab couldn't handle disappointment. Jezebel couldn't tolerate boundaries. Bad combination, but still manageable. Now it was about to become someone else's problem, which tends to happen when powerful people decide that limits are optional. Jezebel looked at the situation and immediately saw what Ahab couldn't. The vineyard was not the obstacle. Naboth was. And unlike Ahab, she wasn't interested in negotiating. She wasn't interested in waiting, and she certainly wasn't interested in respecting the answer she had been given. The king wanted the vineyard. The queen wanted results. One was sulking, the other was solving very differently. Jezebel essentially looked at Ahab's crisis and said what every terrible advisor eventually says: there is an easier way. Historically, those words have an outstanding record of making everything worse. Ahab wanted to buy the vineyard. Jezebel decided it would be simpler to eliminate the reason he couldn't have it. And this is where a small desire becomes evidence of a much bigger problem. Because nobody was fighting over land anymore, they were fighting over entitlement. Jezebel began writing letters in the king's name. Official letters, royal authority, royal seals, royal power. Everything looked legitimate, which is often how illegitimate things prefer to appear. The plan was disturbingly simple. Gather the people, bring charges against Naboth, accuse him of crimes he never committed, create witnesses, create outrage, create guilt. And once enough people believed the story, reality would no longer matter. Funny how old that strategy is. The details changed throughout history. The method never really did. Soon, Naboth found himself at the center of accusations that were entirely fabricated. He wasn't on trial because he had done something wrong. He was on trial because someone important wanted what he owned, and that distinction changes everything. The vineyard was still standing. The law was still standing. The truth was still standing. Naboth was the only thing scheduled for removal. Bureaucracy active, morality unavailable. The terrifying part is how ordinary everything looked. There were procedures, meetings, witnesses, documents, official actions. Everything carried the appearance of justice. Almost none of it contained actual justice. And that's usually how corruption works. The most effective abuse of power rarely arrives dressed as abuse of power. It arrives dressed as procedure. Eventually, the plan succeeded. Naboth was condemned. The innocent man was removed. The obstacle disappeared. And just like that, the vineyard became available, exactly as Jezebel intended. The king had wanted property. An innocent man had paid the price. What started as a rejected offer had become a fatal conspiracy. And this is where the story becomes impossible to excuse, because Ahab could no longer pretend this was about a simple request. The vineyard now carried a cost, a visible cost, a human cost, the kind that doesn't disappear just because the paperwork says everything was legal. The king wanted to purchase, the system chose to destroy. And the most tragic part? The plan worked, at least for a moment. The vineyard was finally free. The obstacle was gone. The goal had been achieved, which should have been the end of the story. Instead, it was the moment the real consequences finally arrived, because some victories come with evidence attached. And Ahab was about to walk into the vineyard he wanted, just as someone else was preparing to meet him there. Ahab finally got the vineyard, and immediately lost the ability to pretend it was just a vineyard, because some acquisitions come with paperwork, others come with evidence. And this is where the story changes again. For 3 chapters, the vineyard looked like the goal. Now it was becoming the receipt. Naboth was gone. The obstacle had been removed. The land was available. Everything had gone according to plan, at least according to the people who created it. From Ahab's perspective, the problem had finally been solved. The vineyard was his. The frustration was over. The disappointment was gone. The answer no had been successfully erased from existence. Mission accomplished, or so it seemed. Because one of the most dangerous moments in any downfall is the moment someone believes they've gotten away with it. Ahab walked into the vineyard, the land he had wanted, the land that had consumed his attention, the land that had started this entire chain of events. And for a brief moment, everything probably looked successful. The king got what he wanted. The queen got results. The plan worked. Case closed. Unfortunately for everyone involved, God did not share that assessment. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable again, because while Ahab was busy enjoying the outcome, someone else was already walking toward the vineyard. A prophet, which, historically speaking, is rarely good news, especially in the Old Testament. The prophet Elijah arrived with a message, not a suggestion, not feedback, not a recommendation for personal growth. A message. And it completely changed the meaning of the vineyard. Until this point, Ahab had treated the land like a prize. Elijah treated it like a crime scene. That distinction mattered a lot, because the vineyard no longer represented success. It represented everything that had happened to obtain it. The lies, the conspiracy, the abuse of power, the innocent blood. Suddenly the land looked different. Funny how that works. The same possession that once felt like a reward can become evidence the moment the truth arrives. Acquisition complete, investigation initiated. Elijah confronted the king directly, and Ahab immediately recognized what was happening, because guilt often notices accountability before accountability even speaks. The king had spent chapters pursuing ownership. Now he was being confronted by consequences, and unlike Naboth, consequences rarely accept counteroffers. The most ironic part of the entire story is that Ahab technically got exactly what he wanted. The vineyard became his, just not in the way he imagined. Because now every vine carried a reminder, every row carried a cost, every corner carried a question. Was it worth it? The answer was becoming increasingly obvious, and this is where the story reveals what it was always about. Not land, not agriculture, not property, power. Specifically, what happens when power encounters a boundary and decides the boundary is the problem? The vineyard was simply the stage where that reality became visible. Ahab thought he had purchased a piece of land. In reality, He had signed for something much larger: responsibility, judgment, consequences. Some victories arrive carrying their own punishment. Some rewards arrive already poisoned, and some receipts become impossible to throw away. The vineyard had looked like the solution. Now it looked like the evidence, and Elijah was about to make sure the king understood the difference, because the story was no longer asking whether Ahab would get the vineyard. The story was now asking what the vineyard was going to cost him. Ahab did not destroy everything because he wanted too much. He destroyed everything because he could not handle being denied one thing. And that is what makes this story so dangerous, because at the beginning, the vineyard looked small, almost insignificant, a minor disagreement, a simple property dispute, nothing that sounded capable of reshaping a kingdom. But some disasters don't begin with giant ambitions. They begin with tiny frustrations that refuse to stay tiny. Looking back, the sequence was surprisingly simple. Ahab wanted the vineyard. Naboth refused. The king sulked. Jezebel acted. An innocent man died. The vineyard changed hands. A prophet arrived. And suddenly, the entire story looked different. What started as desire became entitlement. What became entitlement became abuse. What became abuse became judgment. And that's usually how these stories work. Not all at once, one step at a time. The most fascinating part is that Ahab never set out to destroy everything. People rarely do. Very few wake up in the morning planning to ruin their legacy. Most simply justify one bad decision, then another, until they eventually arrive somewhere they never intended to go. The vineyard exposed exactly that process. Because the issue was never wanting more. Wanting more is normal. The issue was believing that no was unacceptable, that every desire deserved fulfillment, that every obstacle deserved removal, that every boundary was a personal offense. And that mindset is far more dangerous than ambition itself. After all, kingdoms survive ambitious rulers all the time. They struggle much more with rulers who believe limits only apply to other people. Ahab had power, Ahab had wealth, Ahab had influence, but none of those things protected him from himself. Funny how often that happens in history. The greatest threat is rarely outside the palace, it's usually inside it. And this is where the story delivers its final irony. Ahab got the vineyard, exactly as he wanted. The land became his, the obstacle disappeared, the goal was achieved. On paper, he won. In reality, he lost everything that mattered. Because the vineyard never solved the original problem. The original problem was inside the king. And ownership cannot cure entitlement. Power cannot cure insecurity. Success cannot cure a refusal to accept limits. The vineyard simply revealed what was already there. That's why this story still feels surprisingly modern. Not because most people want vineyards, because most people eventually encounter a boundary, a closed door, a denied request, an answer they don't like. And in that moment, character becomes visible. Naboth heard a boundary and respected it. Jezebel heard a boundary and attacked it. Ahab heard a boundary and resented it. 3 people, 1 vineyard, 3 completely different responses, and that difference changed everything. The story began with a piece of land. It ended as a lesson about power, about limits, about the danger of treating frustration like injustice, because sometimes the most expensive mistakes don't begin with hatred or greed or violence. Sometimes they begin when someone powerful hears the word no and decides reality must be wrong. Ahab wanted a piece of land. Instead, he buried his legacy in it. And that's why he didn't lose everything because he wanted too much. He lost everything because he never learned how to hear one simple word: no.